Good afternoon, and welcome to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. It's held here at the Museum of Nebraska History on the third Thursday of every month. My name is Ann Billisbach, and I'm the new Associate Director for Museum and Historic Sites Division. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me thank the Nebraska State Historical Foundation for, Historical Society Foundation, excuse me, for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial assistance makes these programs available to a wide audience who are not able to attend at noon on Lincoln's Channel 5, so we thank them for their financial support. Today's program is on genealogy, researching your family history, and it is presented by Cynthia Monroe. Those of you who have done family history, I think, probably know Cynthia. She's quite a well-known genealogist in town. She was born in Wyoming but raised in Alliance, Nebraska, so she is a Nebraskan, the daughter of an Episcopal priest, and she says she's a very typical preacher's kid. You can ask her what that means. She's an avid genealogist. She began doing genealogy in 1977. She was for many years employed by the Nebraska Brand Committee, part of the Secretary of State's office, and was the livestock brand recorder beginning in 1969 up until 1995 when they moved their offices out of Lincoln, and she decided that she wanted to stay in Lincoln. The Historical Society benefited from that in that while she had volunteered many hours for us prior to that, working in the reference room and helping genealogists, after she was no longer employed by the Brand Commission, we employed her as assistant reference curator in the reference room, where she spent a great deal of time helping genealogists and other researchers. She is back volunteering at the Historical Society in the reference room, and she is employed by the Nebraska legislature for Senator Loudon from the 49th District in northwest Nebraska. Cynthia and her husband, Norm, who has been a Lancaster County Deputy Sheriff for some 37 years and is now retired, have 4 daughters, 10 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. So she has quite a few entries right there on her family tree to take care of. So without further ado, let me introduce Cynthia Monroe.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you for coming. Many faces are very familiar to me, and so I appreciate your coming even though you do know me. So, my program today is on just the very basic part of doing your family history. This is especially aimed at beginners. So, and I'm going to try to leave a little time at the end for any questions that you might have. Family history, I think, is it's a lot of fun to do, and it's a lifelong thing because you never are through getting your research done. Most of my research I have done on my Nebraska side at the State Historical Society. There are also some other there is also information from some other states and countries there, but the Historical Society is the Nebraska State Historical Society. So most of what they collect is Nebraska material, but they have an abundance of marvelous things down there. Other resources in Lincoln that you might want to use would be the Mormon Church Library out on Old Cheney Road, the Lincoln Lancaster County Genealogy Society that has a library at Union College. And then, of course, you have other records in the area that would be state and county and local records that you might wish to access, including morticians' records, things like that. So I'll try to hit some highlights that hopefully will help you do some successful genealogy. I think it's important to be organized, but the thing I'm not going to do is tell you how to organize because everybody's just a little different. My organization is usually on my kitchen counter. But there are different ways you can organize. You can keep notebooks, you can keep file folders, you can color code your family, various and sundry things. There's a wonderful program if you are into computers called Family Tree Maker that's not very expensive. You can buy, I only recommend the basic program because you don't need all the CDs that come with it. So if you do like to keep track on computer, why, there's that resource as well, but you don't have to have a computer to do that. but I do think that it's important to be organized. I did have some handouts. The one that was originally in green on a back side didn't copy very well, but one is a pedigree chart, and this is an example of the pedigree chart. It's like a pedigree chart on a dog or a prize bull or a prize racehorse and a prize family. But this goes from, depending on who you want to start with, whether you want to start with yourself, then you'd be the number one person. But if you're doing this for your children, you might want to start having them as number one, and then research both sides of their lines, because they're interested in both parents' history. So this would be one of the forms that I recommend. They can sell you a lot of forms to do family history, but I think you only need about 2 or 3 to keep yourself organized and see where you are at all times. The next form, which is also on your handout, is what they call a family group sheet. And this is a 3-generational group sheet that is in more detail than a pedigree chart, because it includes siblings, parents, siblings' husbands. There's a place for it on that. And then there's also a place to document where you got your information, which is very important. Always document where you obtained an item, because invariably you want to go back and you don't remember where you got it. So I always recommend that you make a note. Down at the Historical Society, they have 4 little stamps that you can put on whatever it is you found down there. There's one for newspapers, one for manuscripts, Census Records, and RGs. And then it makes it easy just to fill out where you got that and what date you got it. If it's a newspaper, you document the name of the newspaper, the date, and page. And then you can always go back and find that again. So that's a very useful form to have. But a family pedigree chart then accompanies the family group sheet. I always recommend that you might start at home, in your parents' home, or in your grandparents' home, or in their safety deposit box if they'll let you have access to that. You're going to find all kinds of interesting things that they have saved over the years. One of the things my husband's mother saved is every funeral she ever went to, she had one of the little cards that you get at a funeral, and we'll go into that a little later in the program. But they also saved diaries and family Bibles, birth certificates. If you're adopted, there might even be some information on an adoption that they didn't share with you, so that after you're gone, you might be lucky enough to find that in their holdings. But ask them if you can go through some of their personal papers and see what they might have on your family history. You'll be pleasantly surprised. I like to start out with marriage instead of birth, because I always hope that that comes first. And so I start out with marriage records and all the places that you might be able to find marriage records and engagements. It used to be more difficult in the Lincoln and Omaha papers to find marriage announcements and other things like that, but since they've come up with the new Celebrate section, that's really a nice resource as well. I had a young person that her father disappeared, and we couldn't find him. Well, then his folks had their 50th wedding anniversary in the Celebrate section, and it listed the children and the address of the children. So it's kind of a neat resource. But there's all kinds of resources for marriage records, and engagements you'll find only in the newspaper. There's different reasons that people get married, and so you always have to think about what circumstances did they get married under before you start looking for their marriage records. This is an example of a Nebraska marriage record that is from Box Butte County. However, I got the information down at the State Historical Society, because they have most of the county's marriage records on microfilm down there. And this is a marriage record in 1897 of family, and the license itself has more information than the certificate of marriage. The license, of course, asks the name of the bride and groom to be, their age, their color. Sometimes that comes to be interesting in your family history. Their place of birth. Now, luckily, this particular clerk in the county put what county and state. Now, most of the time, you're only going to find a state as far as place of birth. But this particular clerk took down the county of birth as well, which is extremely helpful. The place of residence of the bride and groom at the time that the license was applied for. Then they ask for the parents of the bride and groom in Nebraska. Now, some states don't do that, but Nebraska does. And they ask for the name of the father of both the bride and groom and the name of the mother of the bride and groom, but it's the mother's maiden name, which is extremely helpful because women's records are harder to find than men's records. And so this is an extremely useful item to have. Another thing that's important on the certificate of marriage or the return, the people who stood up or the witnesses. Many times they may be a relative. And so that might be, if you can't go through your direct ancestor, you might be able to go through a sibling or a cousin or something like that. Then the other important item on the marriage document would be who married them, whether it was a county judge or whether it was a clergyman. Now, if it was a clergyman in a church, then you might be able to find those churches' records and find more information on that family. And I'll go into some of that as well a little further down in the program. This is another example of a marriage record as well. This is a marriage record from Nova Scotia in 1882. And they ask pretty much the same questions that they ask on a marriage record in Nebraska. Their place of residence, their place of birth, the names of their parents, including the maiden name of the mother and father, who married them, what they did for a living, things like that. So don't think that just because it's another country that you might not be able to find this information as well. Newspapers are another excellent source, as I referred to earlier. Sometimes the smaller communities have a larger write-up of the marriage than a Lincoln paper might. In smaller communities, I don't think you have to pay for it all the time. So they can have quite an extensive account of the wedding and some of the guests and perhaps some of the grandmothers and grandfathers who attended the wedding. So newspaper resources are an excellent source. The Nebraska State Historical Society has a huge collection of newspapers on microfilm, and they're easily accessible in the reference room. And this is a Norfolk paper that I got down at the State Historical Society. In your mother's trunk, you're going to find family Bibles and family albums. I was fortunate enough to inherit a family album on my mom's side, and these are her grandparents on your left. They had 12 children, and all 12 children grew to adulthood, which is unusual in that time, that all their children survived. And after all their children were grown, then Nancy passed away. This is Nancy and Enoch Payne. And Enoch then married Nancy's brother's wife, who was a widow. And at the bottom of the picture, it told me what her name was. And I thought, boy, that's a very interesting picture. And then I was told by Gail Potter, who used to be here, that he wore the same suit, which was not uncommon at that time. Then, lo and behold, his second wife, Elizabeth, died, and he married again in 1899 to Mary Margaret Tharp. And then Mary Margaret died. I kind of wonder if there was strychnine in the family, but then he married his fourth wife, but he had a prenuptial agreement that she would be entitled to $300. So that's something else you might be able to find in county records, are prenuptial agreements. And that he'd already given her $100, so she was to get $200 and no more. And then she passed away, and then a few years after that, then he passed away as well. But again, he still has on the same suit. So he's getting thinner. This is an announcement of an elopement. This is my husband's parents, and we found this in the paper announcing where they, and if you don't find something in paper, it's sometimes hard to find where they went to get married. But this is a fairly detailed account of when they eloped and where they went. So there's, like I say, there's different ways people manage to get away and get married. And then you're going to have birth records. Did the stork bring us? Makes me wonder what stork was really up to. Now he's pondering too. Now, was it me that did that? So birth records are a little bit more difficult to find. In the state of Nebraska, they did not start keeping track of births and deaths until 1904 and after. And for several years, might not find a recording of a birth because there were still so many home births, and people didn't know to send it in or didn't know where to send it, or perhaps early mail, it got lost in the mail. So until after about 1910, you may or may not find a birth record, but it's always worth going down to the State Department of Vital Records in the State Office building to look for that birth record. The birth record also has a great deal of information on it. It always asks, of course, the name of the child, weight, whether it was a single, double birth, things like that. How many children have been born to this woman before this child. So you might be able to find out if there have been miscarriages or something like that way. It also asks the name of the father and age, what he did for a living. It's a place of birth as well. And it usually asks, in many cases, the place of birth of the parents. It also asks the name of the mother of the child and then the same information for her as well. And then the doctor, of course, who delivered the baby, if in case that was the case. This is a record of a delayed registration of birth. This gentleman was born in 1894. This is my half-uncle. And he was born in Nebraska before they started keeping birth records. So when the Second World War came along, if you were perhaps going to join the service or work in some plant that had to do with making materials for war, you had to prove that you were a citizen of the United States or where you were born. And so many people, many people filed delayed registrations of birth. The State Historical Society has Lancaster counties, 11 volumes of about 600 pages to a volume. So that might be something else. If you cannot find that, there might be a delayed registration of birth. And sometimes that delayed registration has more information than the original birth certificate that would have been filed at the time of birth, because you have to present 3 proofs or affidavits of your birth. A family Bible. In this it says the family record of births in the family Bible. That's one of the things, and I ended up inheriting that page out of the family Bible. His mother is still alive, so she testifies to that birth. And sometimes you might be able to find a baptismal record included or something like that. So this was filed in 1940, I can't remember, 41. So just not too long after the war started, and he was going to go to work for TWA, so he had to prove his birth. Baptismal records. If you can't find a birth record, you might be able to find evidence of their birth in a baptismal record. And those go back as far as that particular church has their records. And depending on what faith it is as well. Some churches keep baptismal records and some don't. Some have cradle rolls or things like that. But you might be able to find enough information off of those. State Historical Society has many church records, but also if you're trying to find where that denomination's records are, just call a local church of that faith and they come and give you some help on where to go look for church records. This is a 2-page entry, and it gives the name of the child, the sex of the child, the names of the parents, the names of the sponsors. And many times you're going to find that a sponsor may be a relative as well. So that could be useful information, but then it tells you who their friends were. Then also on this next, this is a 2-page item, but I merged them together. It gives you the date and place of birth. So if you cannot find a birth record, then you might be able to find it in the baptismal record. And of course the date of the baptism and where the baptism took place. And that also would lead you perhaps to some other records. Maybe that child stayed and grew up in that church and eventually married in that church. So this is a good place to look for records of your family if you can't find them at a birth certificate. In Nebraska, you can only get birth and death certificates at the state level. Places like Iowa, you can get them both county and state level, but the state of Nebraska is the one who collects information for birth and death records. This is just a sample page of the entry as the church kept the records. And they're in chronological order. This is a certificate of baptism that's given to the child at the time of baptism, and it also includes on this certificate the date and place of birth. So if you might This might be something you find again in your mother's or your grandmother's trunk, the documents that they may have kept. Some churches also have confirmations, and on the confirmation records, they also ask you about birth and baptism. So even if the child might not, the person might not have been baptized there, they might have been confirmed there, which will lead you back to where they were born or where they were baptized. And that's just a second page of that same record. Sometimes you're going to find a divorce in the family, and those records are going to be found in Nebraska at the clerk of the district court. And then this Department of Vital Records will give you a certificate of divorce, or the document that actually is the official divorce document. But at the county level, you'll also get be able to find, before they had no-fault divorce, exactly the testimony or the reasons for that divorce. And those are very interesting. My grandmother got a divorce in the early 1900s, and I have several pages of the testimony at that, and it makes it very interesting. Not pleasant, but interesting. And we all have interesting families. I'll tell you another thing about somebody in my family. This is the certificate of divorce, and it tells, again, the name of the couple, where they're living, their residence. This is Cheyenne County. It asks their race and their age, their place of birth for both the bride and the groom, what their occupations are. She was a telephone operator and he was a laborer, probably on the Union Pacific. The names of her parents and his parents. The maiden name of the wife, the person involved in the divorce. The date of the marriage. So if you don't know when or where they may have gotten married, the divorce record might include that information for you. Most likely it will. And the date they filed for the divorce, the grounds under which they got a divorce. It also asks if there's any children affected by that divorce. And their only child was deceased, but it will give you the number of children that this family might have, and so you also might find some records on where they had to pay child support if there were children. So divorce records also include a lot of the information that you might be looking for previously. Then there's going to be death records that you're going to want to look up. I find that cemeteries are a wonderful place to go, number one, for that information, and number two, it's a nice quiet place to take a walk. And the tombstones are interesting. The state of Nebraska issues death certificates, starting again in about 1904. But again, very few mortuaries are up and going by then. People were still kept in the home after they died. Some records did not get sent in. People took care of the burial themselves, or the furniture maker that owned the furniture store made you a casket or a box. So some of the death records didn't get to the historical, or didn't get to the Department of Vital Statistics until later on. But there's other ways to find those. But again, a death record is a very important document to try to find. But let me tell you, the information on a death certificate is not generally going to be as correct as an information on a birth certificate or a certificate of marriage, because the birth certificate and the certificate of marriage are usually filled out by the people involved. A certificate of death, the person is not always that directly involved. Or as a child, you might know your grandfather grew up in Pennsylvania. So you assume he was born there, but probably he was born in Ohio or something like that. In this case, this is my great-grandmother, and they were both quite elderly, and her husband was the informant. He didn't remember. He's starting to be senile and doesn't remember, so the information isn't complete, and a little bit of it isn't accurate. I also think that he lied a lot, because there's no document I can find that has the same year of birth or the same place of birth. So, and it tells what that person died of on this document. And that's important if you're doing genetic research. I have a granddaughter that has a serious genetic condition, so I went back through and checked all the reasons of death, doing a genetic background. And I think that's, number one, just very interesting, even if you don't need to have that. You might take better care of yourself if you find out what one of your ancestors died of. But like I say, a death certificate generally is going to have quite a bit of information that's useful, and it does ask the name of the parents of the person of the deceased, and in this case, he did not know the maiden name of the mother, so that isn't there. And a lot of times they don't know. This is an obituary out of a newspaper. This is a Sydney newspaper that I found down at the State Historical Society. I'm going to plug my favorite place to do research. And obituaries usually have quite a bit of good information. This even tells that she was a native of Kentucky, moved to Missouri when she was 13, moved to Chicago when she was 20. It says she married George Graves. Well, this is my mom's mom, and she didn't marry George Graves. She had a child with him, but they weren't married. My mom didn't want me to do family history, and this was one of the two reasons. And then it tells when she was married to her second husband, and they were the ones whose divorce I looked up. And then it tells, again, who she married for a third husband. And then it tells the names of her children who survive her and the places where they live. So that if you haven't found your cousins, and they might have some genealogy information, now you have a little bit of a clue as to where to go to find those relatives. This is, again, a church record of a burial. So this is, again, another really good source of information that you're going to find, or hopefully find. And it also tells their last place of residence. Sometimes, you know, people die in California, but they're brought back here for burial, and you may not have known where they died to get that document of death, or perhaps a better obituary. Here's Horace Cooper, who's a male. He's 22. He was baptized and confirmed and a member of the congregation, but his last place of residence is the state hospital. So you might be able to find some records out at the state hospital, and then the date of death is on there. And then this is the second page of a burial record. And these burial records at the church also indicate the cause of death. So if it's before they started keeping records in Nebraska at Vital Statistics, you might be able to find some of that information in earlier church records. And it tells you also where they were buried, because it wasn't always locally. These is a really, it's not a good example, I know, because it's very difficult to read, but the city of Omaha kept a few birth and death records before the state began keeping them. So if you have somebody in Douglas County, it's worth looking at these records down at the State Historical Society, the archives. And what it is just an entry on a page, but it still has useful information. Newspapers, in my opinion, are a great source of information. I always hope that current journalists keep things accurate, because someday you're going to use those for your record keeping or finding an article. And I have some examples of some what we call non-typical newspapers. Newspapers that were published but not delivered to your door, like the Lincoln paper or the Omaha paper. These are papers that you had to subscribe to for a particular reason. This is a legal newspaper that's printed in Lincoln and one in Omaha. They're two separate papers because they have separate information, because it's documents that are found at the county level and the local level. And within those newspaper accounts, they also record marriages, births, and deaths. And in some cases, you can find out when they bought a car, when a lien was filed against them, things like that. If there's an adoption, you might be able to go through the legal newspaper and find a county court case involving adoption if you're having trouble with adoption records. Not always, but it's, to me, a good recommended source if you're doing that. Quit claim deeds of a house transfers, ownership, things like that in a legal newspaper. And these are on microfilm at the State Historical Society, and I believe these started in the 1930s. This is a sample of a Legion newspaper that's on microfilm at the Society. And in this time period, the Lincoln papers weren't doing very long obituaries at that time, and so these newspapers will have a longer obituary for that person for whom you're looking. There's like the Legion, there's the Masons, different fraternal organizations or other organizations that a person might have belonged to, that something's going to appear about them in that newspaper. Any special awards they might have gotten. And, of course, if it's a Legion paper, that would lead you to military records. This is a foreign language, well, I shouldn't say foreign language newspaper, that's incorrect. This is a Native American newspaper called the Word Carrier. They also have foreign language newspapers on microfilm at the Society because there were so many Germans and Bohemians and other races that settled in Nebraska and had newspapers printed in their own language. But you can usually find a copy of an item about the person because their name is still the name as you would read it in English in these newspapers. So once you can find a copy of the article that you're looking for, you can take it to somebody to translate for you. This is from the Santee Training School. These are the funeral cards that I was talking about that my mother-in-law saved every one she went to. She must have had 200 in a shoebox. And we went through and sorted them all out as to whether they were family or not family. They don't have a great deal of information on them, but if you don't have any information, it's better than nothing. This particular one is a good example of a funeral card because it also gives the obituary in here. Many of them don't, but they are going to give you a date and place of birth and a date and place of death. It's going to tell you who the pallbearers are, and in some cases those are relatives. And it's also going to give you the name of a church that they may have been buried from. Not everybody's buried out of a church, some of the mortuaries, but then the mortuary might have some better information. Mortuaries keep excellent records. This is another example of a funeral card that didn't have the obituary on it. So if you're really a true blood genealogist, when you pass away, have them put your obituary on the funeral card. This is an example, and I know it's hard to read because it's a small document, of a probate record. And this is a probate record from Oregon, I believe. This is a friend of mine's ancestor who went on the Oregon Trail and ended up in Oregon City, Oregon. And these have a great deal of information on them as well. Number one, it tells you how much this person was worth, what kind of property they owned. Then it also tells the name of the heirs. These are children of the deceased. I'll go back. It starts at the bottom here. And what town they're living in at the time the probate was filed. And the probate is filed in the clerk of the county court in Nebraska. There are other books that will tell you what courts to go to for these kinds of records. And I will get into that, too, if I don't talk too long. But this particular record tells the names of the heirs and their address at that time. So that might lead you to some additional records. For those of you who know that, this is Claudia Lindley's ancestor. And so then they tell you that also the date and place of death of the person that is being probated. There's all kinds of other resources that if you use your imagination or creativity or talk to somebody else that you would be able to use to keep records of your family history. I don't want just to know who he was, when he was born, when he married, and when he died. I want to know a little bit more about that person because they are interesting people. So you have to think outside the box, be creative. I have a friend named Teresa that's always telling us to think outside the box. This is that Bible record that I talked about earlier that was used to file that delayed registration of birth. Now, in my opinion, there's two kinds of Bible records, not so good and very good. This is a not so good. My grandmother sat down, I think, one day and wrote down all this information about her family. She, again, did not note when she married George Graves, the father of her first child, because I don't think there was anything to write. And, but she talks about his birth. But she tells here what her maiden name was, where she was born, the names of her children, and her marriage to the father of most of her children, and her marriage to her third husband, the date, and then a little bit of information about her third husband. Now, the writing is all the same on this document. Your writing changes over the years. And the writing is all the same. She used the same instrument to write with. If you're going to be filling this in as the events happen, you're going to use probably a pen that sometimes might be blue ink or black ink or a thicker head on the pen. Sometimes they might have written it in pencil. So if you find information like that, that's probably going to be a more accurate document. Also, my grandmother had 11 children. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children on this document. Those other 6 children passed away, and she did not include them in her Bible record. So this is an example. I mean, it's good information for what is there, but there's a lot that is not here. So pay attention to the writing, what was used for a writing instrument, and then you'll know whether it's a little bit more complete record. Then there's other kinds of records that you might be able to find. This is the second reason my mom didn't want me to do family history. And so you're going to be able to find various kinds of records on these people. My uncle stole turkeys, and he got charged with a felony. And this was in the 30s, mind you, and he might have been hungry. But he was also kind of a scallywag. But this is the newspaper account of what he did. Let me go back. There's also the state, the Historical Society has the state penitentiary records. And you can go back and find my uncle in those penitentiary records. Then I was helping a friend of mine whose father was in the penitentiary in Colorado in Canyon City. I'll be darned, there's my uncle again. So you're going to find some interesting records about your family. Census records are a very valuable tool, and that's one of the things I recommend that you do early on is follow your family through the census records. The United States of America started keeping census records in 1790, and the purpose of the census in 1790 was to determine how many eligible males for war there were going to be, because they had just gotten through with their war against England, and they needed to know how many young men were going to be eligible. So that was the first reason for the census. The reasons for the census have changed over the years, therefore the questions have changed over the years. But this is following one family, 1860, 1870, 1880, and then you see the number of children change or increase or decrease depending on whether they've grown and moved out of the household or whether additional children have been born in the next 10 years. And the other thing that's really helpful here, on the place of birth of the children, this gives you a migration pattern of the family. So I think that's one of the reasons that census records are important to follow. Another wonderful surprise on census records, here are my great-grandparents, William Null and Alfreda Waldron Null, and their children, 4 of their children. The set of twins died shortly after birth. But here's a woman living in the household with a different name. I found later that that's her mother, so now I know her maiden name. Alfreda's mother is now living in the household. And it tells about the birth of her mom as well. In another census record, a male was living with them, and it turned out to be a grandfather. So those are records that'll help you as well. But the migration pattern, age that they are, 1900 census will give you their exact date of birth, but that's the only census that'll do that. The 1900 census will also tell you if they're naturalized, and it'll also tell you when they came to this country. This is just another example of the census record. And here is the one that Caleb Oliver is living in the house, and that's Elizabeth Waldron's father, Caleb Oliver. So that gives me another generation, and it tells us that he was born in Massachusetts. So it'll tell you what state you need to go back to next to try to find him. This is another example of a census record. It's a little bit larger and easier to read. City directories. City directories are a wonderful resource. Really small communities generally don't have city directories, but in really small communities, everybody knows everybody. But this is Salem, Massachusetts, and I followed my dad's family from the time they moved there from Canada in 1888 down through 1924. And in here it tells me all the addresses they lived and what my grandfather did for a living. And then it starts, here's Mary showing up. This is Mary, their oldest child, who grew up and now is in a household of her own, so that you can follow when the children are leaving home. It tells when the Great Fire of Salem took place, and that's when my grandfather was injured. tells where he worked. And then in 1924, it tells that one of their children is removed to Colorado, which I think is an interesting term. We don't use that very much anymore. He just moved. And this is my dad, who went to Greeley, Colorado to go to seminary. And so this tells me what year he left home. So that'll tell you when to start going to Colorado to start looking for records, which we did. We went through the seminary records to find things. The State Historical Society has county and local histories, many of them in book form. This is just an example out of Saunders County. We had a tombstone that we didn't know where it belonged. My husband and I collect stolen tombstones and try to find where they belong. And using these documents, we found the parents of this child and where they were living, and so we found where that tombstone belonged. But this is going to give you some history about families that came to Saunders County from somewhere else. But almost every county has a county history down at the Historical Society or at their local historical society or library. In your smaller communities, many of your Historical Society documents are in the local library. So always call a librarian for help. This is an example of a military record. This is a Civil War and enlistment document. Now, it's not going to have much family history on it because they didn't care who your parents were when you enlisted in the Civil War. But it does tell that they were fair-haired, they had blue eyes, how tall they were, things that just might be interesting that tell why I'm so short and have light-colored hair. But I think military documents are an important document to pursue. And the Historical Society has the document that you can write the National Archives and get the military documents. The pension records are the ones that have the most information, and so you always want to ask for the pension record because it'll tell, number one, when they enlisted, sometimes what battles they fought in, if they were wounded, where they were wounded and what happened, and then it'll tell you the different places they lived. Moved from place to place. If it's a declaration by the widow for a pension, many times you're going to find a marriage document in those records because she had to prove that she was married to that veteran. So you might find that information. It also asks what children are affected. And so if there's still children living at home, it's going to name those children. But military records are a wonderful resource. This is another example of an enlistment record. And it tells what he did for a living. He was a blacksmith. And that's kind of interesting to find out what kind of trades they had at that time as well. Might have been a cooper, who's a barrel maker, things like that. This is an honorable discharge paper. Other things that you're going to find that I think that this is an off-the-wall type of thing to look at. Many churches put out church directories. And so they're going to have some pictures in many of those cases. So you might be able to find a picture of your ancestor in one of the church history books or their annual report. This is a front cover off of a 1955 Alliance Bulldogs yearbook from high school. And I had a friend who adopted a child whose mother graduated from a high school in central Nebraska, and she wanted her children to know what their mother looked like. So we went to Grand Island and looked up the yearbook and found a picture of her mother and made a copy of it. So those are kind of things that I have my mother's yearbooks too, and they're interesting to go back and look at the different styles and some of the things they said. They told her, small of stature, big of heart, will argue much if given a start. They had little sayings for them then, which told a little bit about their personality. This is an example of a newspaper advertisement in about 1902 telling who in that area has cattle and what brands are on those cattle. In case an animal strays into your yard and you don't know who it belongs to, then you can look up to see who owns that brand in the newspaper. You can also write the brand department and find that out. But you can find out if they did ranch and if they did have cattle. This is an example out of the legal notices in a newspaper, which are important to look at as well. They might tell you when a probate is being advertised or whether the sheriff is taking their farm away. You'll find a lot of that in the 30s. You'll find when they homesteaded, there was an advertisement in the legal section of the paper as well. So you'll be able to find homestead records. I don't have an example of a homestead record here, but Nebraska has wonderful homestead records. And you can look them up at the Historical Society and then right off to the National Archives for the complete record. And those are very interesting. There's a book called The Handy Book for Genealogists, which if you don't know what court in New York State to write for a certain document, this will tell you what court takes care of births, deaths, divorces, probates, things like that. So there's a lot of useful how-to books out there. And that's just a sample page out of that book. It's too hard to read. Family letters, old family letters are very useful because they'll tell you if somebody's recently passed away or if your Aunt Carrie had a new child, things like that. What their lifestyle is like at that time. And I always like to type them out. And that way you also remember more of what's in the document, and it's much easier to read once you've typed it out. But don't get rid of the original letter. Keep the original letter, especially if it's very old. This is an example of a naturalization record after 1920. Before 1920, there's not as much information on them, but I still think they're important to get. They will tell you what country they're giving up sovereignty to and when they came to this country. But this is one after 1920 that asks a lot of questions about where he was born, where he left, what port he departed from, who his spouse was or her spouse. But more often, you're going to find males that are naturalized. Before 1920, there was very little reason for females to naturalize because what could they do? They couldn't vote. Most of the time, they didn't own property in their own name. So they were automatically considered citizens on the naturalization of their husband or their father and sometimes their brother. But this is a very good example of a naturalization record because it tells what ship they came over on and those kinds of things that you're looking for, and in this case, a picture of him. And I hope and wish you all success in your work. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, I'll try.
Federal census.
Well, it depends on, well, yes, you can go to Kansas City to the branch archives. Omaha Omaha Public Library has a huge collection of census records now.
There's other states, I mean. Yeah.
Yes, they do. They're trying to collect the entire collection. You can go out to the Mormon Church and order any of them. I think it only costs $3.50 to order a roll of microfilm through the Mormon Church on Old Cheney Road, yes. I think it's like 3400 Old Cheney Road. But there's also a library in Independence that has all of the census records as well. But there's lots of places not too far away that you can go get those without having to order them and wait. Because I think you have better success if you're right there, and because it's going to lead you to the next census record, and that way you can just go pick out the next roll and you don't lose your train of thought like I do if I have to wait for that next roll. So, but now Nebraska has all of Nebraska's, and then they have a few surrounding states, like Iowa and Kansas and things like that. So it's worth going down here to look first. And then if you go out to the Mormon library, other people have ordered, so you might look to see if that's already out there on order. And you're welcome to read those if somebody else has ordered them. Yes?
The first records, like in 1900, would they be county or state, or would the records or the Historical Society, would they have them?
In some cases, the Historical Society would have them. They don't have as many of those documents as they do the other ones. It depends on what the county gives to the State Historical Society, whether they're running out of room. But in the state of Nebraska, that's always going to be at the clerk of the county court. It's not you can find the certificate of divorce at the Department of Vital Records, but the actual divorce case is going to be at the clerk of the county court. And adoptions take place in the county court. Yes, Harold?
You said in the early days the naturalization records didn't provide too much information.
That's correct.
Where would you look for them? My ancestors up in the Douglas-Sarpy County area in the 1850s. Where would you look to see if they had filed for citizenship?
We have the Douglas County Naturalization Records at the State Historical Society. And there is an index that goes up to 1906 in alphabetical order by person. an index, general index to all the naturalizations in Nebraska and western Iowa. And that's the easier place to start than it is with Douglas County. Douglas County is not the easiest place to research. But they will help you down there at the Historical Society, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Do you have another question, Harold?
Yeah. And for another great-grandfather that was briefly in Nebraska, but started out in Ohio, wandered back and forth, finally ended up in southeastern Iowa. Where for naturalization there? Any place that he might have been or lived for a while?
Well, I'd probably start at the last known place. Would he be on the 1900 census?
He was dead before then.
The 1880 census, I'm trying to think if that has a place for
He
naturalization.
spent about 30, 35 years in southeastern Iowa.
I would start then with Iowa, go over to the Iowa Historical Society and start looking in there, yes. And then Iowa also has a wonderful state genealogy society library in Des Moines. But I would go there to see if their naturalizations are indexed. And if you stayed in a particular county, you might try that county. But you might look in the census records for every 10 years to see where he was in Iowa.
I've gone through that.
Okay. But he kind of moved around a little bit. It makes it a little more difficult when they moved
Well,
around.
he stayed put for about the last 25 years.
Then I would,
But before that, he moved a lot, and I don't know what he'd have done about citizenship during that time span.
and he could have filed a petition for citizenship in one state and received his naturalization in another state. But in many of the records, the naturalization sometimes also has the application for citizenship with it. Not all the time, but much of the time.
Basically, what I'm looking for is his application, because I'm trying to
Mhm.
get information on exactly where he came from and when.
Have you gone into Ancestry at all at the public library? I would go try the Ancestry because they also have an index to some passenger lists and immigration records.
But I don't know.
Just put his name in. You go to
All I have
Ancestry?
is a name. I don't know what vote, what.
Well, it might come up with names of people that might lead you to that right area. I would try Ancestry. It costs money to belong to Ancestry, and so if you're an avid genealogist and a crazy one, then you belong. But otherwise, you can go to the public library and
Can
use
you look
theirs.
Under the name?
Yes. Or you can call me, Harold. I'll look it up.
Thank you.
Yes.
Last question. On this vital statistics, where's that located, and do you have to fill out a form telling them just exactly what you want?
Yes. They're on the third floor of the state office building, but in June, they're moving to the Golds building. And there's 4 forms you can fill out there. There's application for birth, application for death, application for marriage, and application for death. And you fill that out, as much information as you know, and you take it to the desk, and it's $8 for a birth and $7 for the other 3 records. And you have to pay that whether or not they find it, because it's a search fee. And if they find it, you just get the document with it. Yes, ma'am?
Isn't there 1 year of the census that is missing?
Pardon, one census, 1890. The 1890 census, some of it burned in a major fire, some of it was very wet, some of it was very fine, but the federal government threw it out, thinking none of it was worthwhile if they didn't have part of it. But what exists is there are a few states that the census still exists for 1890. And there's a record of what those states are down at the Historical Society. But there's a census of veterans that does survive. And many times most of the people in 1890, many of the people in 1890 were Civil War veterans. So that's a nice substitute to use in case they were a veteran. Otherwise, there is that gap. The state of Nebraska took an 1885 census. States took censuses too, and some of them, like Iowa, took them every 10 years, 5 years after the federal census. So Iowa, you can go up to 1925, but the state of Nebraska, you can only use the 1885. That's the only one they took. So you might try that. Yes?
You have to be a relative to get death certificate. I asked for one for my aunt in Arkansas, and I was denied because I was an immediate family.
Oh, really? Different states have different rules. Sometimes you might want to fib. And the state of Nebraska, if you're not related, they'll let you look at the document, even though they won't let you have a copy. And you just take a paper and pencil and just transfer the information. They'll let you look at the document. It still costs you $7 to have a look, though. Yes.
How much of this stuff's on computers now?
There's more and more all the time. There's a free website called the US GenWeb, and each county participates or doesn't participate in that. And there's different kinds of information. Some have detailed cemetery records, indexes to marriages. State of Minnesota's birth index is on there. And that's a free website. Also, the LDS Family History Center is a free website to use. So, and there are people who will help you use those websites.
You can also access Heritage Quest at the libraries.
Oh, can you?
Ancestry.
Thank you. I don't belong to that particular one. How are we on time, Ann?
I think we're going to start filming pretty quickly, but you can go on it.
Oh, I can't.
Maybe we should
Oh, you'll be here all day.
Thank you on film, though. So.
And you can always call me at home. And down at the State Historical Society, there's always somebody in the room that'll help you. Out at the Mormon Library, they're volunteers and some are more helpful. Yes, Deb?
Provide the address of the Nebraska State Historical Society for those that don't know.
Yes, I could. It's 1500 R Street. You go into the round fronted stone building. Once you get inside, past the center hall, then you turn to your right. The phone number is 471-4751. They are closed on Mondays and Tuesday mornings and Sundays.
We're open on Tuesday mornings now.
Oh, you are?
Summer hours.
Oh, cool. Good news.
Summer hours.
Good news. So, and there's always somebody there to help you. So, and they're open Saturdays, which is a great day to go down there as well. Thank you very much.